I mentioned this last week, I think. I mean, when you walk around the inner suburbs of Melbourne, as I do, particularly in the inner east and inner southeast, I can't walk down a street or go around a block without seeing, in particular, Quentin, one-bedroom apartments that are up for sale. And there's hundreds of them. And I can only presume they are investors fleeing the market because of the taxation changes, property taxation changes in particular, that were introduced by the former Andrews government, now the current Allen government.
Well, not just property taxes, but also regulation. I mean, what we've seen in the May budget alone was the fact that your land tax has gone up. There's been a levy added on top of that for COVID relief. And then the threshold has come down. So the threshold where you started to pay land tax kicked in at about $300,000. That has now come down to $50,000, which means that every small investor, every person who is trying to make a go for their future is now going to be captured by land tax as well as a COVID levy on top of that. We now then have a vacant property tax, which has been increased and expanded statewide. So essentially, if you have a vacant property and you're not living in it, you will get taxed for it. What we don't understand is why the government has to continue going just straight down the pathway of tax, punish, punish, punish. What we're saying is incentivise. If you go the other way, if you say to these investors, if you say to mum and dads who are trying to make a go of it, here is an incentive. If you keep the property rented for 5 years, we'll give you a portion of your land tax back in the form of a rebate. And then every 5 years after that, if you've kept it rented, we'll give you another portion of your land tax back. They'll still make their taxes, but at the same time, they're incentivising rather than saying, if you don't do it our way, we're going to punish you.
What's going to happen to the younger generation? I mean, we have constant discussion about how they're never going to be able to afford to buy real estate in markets like Melbourne and Sydney in particular because of the price. And so they may become lifetime renters. But if there's nowhere to rent, they're stuck between an absolute rock and a hard place. What are we going to do with these young folk?
Well, that's a very good point, Steve. We are in a position where we need a massive injection of supply. We need to increase supply dramatically. But the problem with supply is you can't simply pop down to Bunnings and buy a block of flats or buy a suburb. It just doesn't happen. But the government has to start working on it, and they have to also look at public housing supply, not just looking at what they're calling affordable housing or build to rent. They have to bring to market a sizable quantity of social housing and public housing so that they can take the pressure off that private rental market and look after the people that need to be looked after the most. Because at the moment, they're not supplying that housing, which is pushing that cohort into the private market and putting more pressure on the low stocks that we already have in that area of the marketplace.
Yeah, we need leadership, political leadership, both in Canberra and in Melbourne. Quentin, thank you very much for joining us and explaining that.